All right, the third attack on privacy, eavesdropping. Now, when we talk about eavesdropping in this class, it will always be technical. It's not me listening into your phone conversation or overhearing you talking out in the lobby. Eavesdropping means that I have gotten access to your network and I've attached a device called a protocol analyzer, also known as a sniffer. And that's how we'll refer to it in class because that really is the more common lingo that we use. So what a packet analyzer does is it captures traffic on the network, and it has a management console where I, as an administrator or as an attacker, can view the contents. Now, anything you put on your network in plain text, I have full access to. So if you're sending passwords across the network in plain text, I see your passwords, but also any sort of data. So we want to be very cognizant that eavesdropping is a very real threat today. You know, Wireshark is a great utility. It's very user-friendly. It's very, very popular, and that's great. But the downside to that is that many, many people have it. Many people are skilled in using it. You don't have to be that high-end an attacker to do a scan or to do, not a scan, but a packet capture on the network. Your defense against that, against eavesdropping, a couple of things. First of all, don't let somebody on your network that doesn't belong on your network. Now, I know that sounds very much like common sense, and it is. However, I can't tell you how many networks I walk into with live ports in the lobby open to make things easier for guests of the organization. And that's fine. There's always that balance between ease of use and security. But allowing a stranger, allowing somebody that hasn't been really authenticated or vetted access to my network presents a very, very real threat. A little later on in the modules later, we'll talk about setting up a rogue infrastructure and how all I need is a live port on the wall. And I'll bring in my own DNS server, my own DHCP server, and I'll guarantee you a certain portion of your hosts will come to my rogue devices. So we want to be very cautious about that. So the best way to avoid eavesdropping is to prevent somebody's access from connecting to my network. Keep ports that aren't in use blocked. Enable MAC filtering. And I understand that MAC filtering is easy to bypass. You can spoof MAC addresses. I understand that. But the bottom line is it's still part of a layered defense. Okay? Physical security. Also, technical security. Keep plain text off the network if it's sensitive. Now, again, though, we have to do the cost-benefit analysis. There's always a trade-off for security because then the thought becomes, well, let's just encrypt everything. Well, you can just encrypt everything, but you're going to see performance take a huge hit. So senior management really has to be involved in determining encryption policy because if everything on the network is encrypted, things move very slowly. So again, it's that cost-benefit analysis. What's the value of what we're transmitting on the network and letting that value determine whether or not it's worth the trade-off for encryption. Now, even better than encryption, because one of the things that I always try to stress to people, attackers don't care what your passwords are. An attacker does not want to know your password. When I'm doing a pen test, I don't care what your password is. What I want to do is I want to be able to use your password. And I know that sounds like I'm splitting hairs there, but I'm not. So many people feel like, oh, my password is encrypted, so it's safe because an attacker can't see it. And that's true. But if I could capture your password on the network, and if I could replay it later, I don't care that I couldn't read your password. I was able to use your password. So the point I'm trying to make with that is encryption is not the only solution when it comes to eavesdropping. It might be part of the solution, but with replay attacks, somebody that captures a packet, replays it later, I don't care I couldn't see your password as long as I gain access to the system. Technical solutions are not enough. We've got to think about the next step. One of the things that we would consider, especially for passwords, because they are such high value, let's just keep passwords off the network altogether. You know, fine, encryption is a step in the right direction, but would be so much better if we didn't transmit passwords across the network. And if you really think about that, networking. You know, why did networking come about? What is networking all about? It's about sharing. So if you look at network security, it's almost an oxymoron. You almost have two ideas that are in direct contrast. Network says, let's share, let's make things available. Security says, let's not make things available. Let's lock things down. So what we want to find is we want to find a way to protect the network and protect those sensitive pieces of information. But sometimes when push comes to shove, the best way to protect things is to keep them off the network, like passwords. And when we talk about Kerberos, that's one of the things that Kerberos does for us. Kerberos allows me as a user to prove I know my password without sending my password across the network. And the way that works is almost like a challenge response system, where I go to log on to the domain perhaps, and the domain controller is going to respond with a challenge. The only way my system can answer that challenge properly is if my password was typed in correctly. So if you think about that, I've just proven I know my password without putting my password on the network, which is much better. It's a much better idea. Okay? Not to mention anything we put on the network is vulnerable to brute force attacks and so on. But the other issue is when I first come onto the domain as a client computer, the only way I know who to send my credentials is that I ask DNS. And at least this is in a directory services environment. And I know not all of you are in directory services environment, but basically the way this looks is when I log onto a system, I query DNS and I say, where's the closest domain controller? DNS comes back and says, send your credentials to server 1. But the thing with that is, I don't know who server 1 is. And I just mentioned a second ago that it's fairly easy to set up a rogue infrastructure. If you're going to a rogue DNS server, they're going to send you to a rogue domain controller, which if I sent my password to a domain controller we haven't even authenticated yet, all of a sudden I've got a password going to somebody that could be impersonating a legitimate host. So that's another problem that Kerberos solves. And it's something, Kerberos uses something called zero knowledge proof. And again, it's that idea. Let me prove that I know the password without sending you information that you shouldn't have because I don't trust you yet as a domain controller or whatever. I hope that makes sense. Kerberos is pretty cool in the idea. Not saying Kerberos is perfect, but that premise of let's keep passwords off the network, let's not send passwords to unauthenticated servers, let's prove we know our passwords without sending them. And that's a big deal. That's a step in the right direction. So for the third problem, eavesdropping, the way we want to solve or mitigate that, certainly encrypt sensitive information, but even better, keep it off the network altogether. Okay. So that's the section on confidentiality. We have the other elements of integrity, authenticity, and non-repudiation, which we'll get to in just a moment.